That is what we are talking about. Terrorism. That's what we are talking about. Where are they coming from? But meanwhile, let's listen to our guest and hear where he is coming from. Thank you, sir.
Ẹ ṣé púpọ̀ olóòtú, ẹ kúlé gbogbo ènìyàn mo kí yín púpọ̀. Orúkọ mi ni Tèmítọ́pẹ́ Babátúndé Oríọlá, ọmọ Ifẹ̀wàrà, Ọ̀ṣun State ní Nàìjíríà ni mí. Wọ́n bí mi sí ilẹ̀ Abẹ́òkúta ni mo dàgbà sí, ibẹ̀ mo ti lọ ilé ìwé àkọ́kọ́ bẹ̀rẹ̀ àti ilé ìwé girama. Àti ibẹ̀ mo wá lọ sí Yunifásítì ti Adó-Èkìtì. Láti Adó-Èkìtì mo ti wá lọ ṣe NYSC ní ìlú Àbújá, ní Yunifásítì ìlú Àbújá. Mo bẹ̀rẹ̀ ẹ̀kọ́ master's degree ní Yunifásítì Àbújá. Láti ibẹ̀ ni mo wá gba scholarship lọ sí ilé ìwé Yunifásítì Manitoba ní ìlú Canada níbí. Nígbà tí mo wá parí masters, mo wá gba scholarship wá sí Edmonton níbí, lọ sí University Alberta ní ìlú Edmonton. Ibẹ̀ ni mo ti ṣe PhD mi. Bí mo ṣe parí PhD mi, wọ́n fún mi ní award tí à ń pè ní Governor General of Canada Academic Gold Medal, tí wọ́n dá sílẹ̀ ní ọdún 1893 ní Canada ń bí. Ẹni tó jẹ́ Governor General ẹ̀kẹta ní Canada ni ló bẹ̀rẹ̀ award yẹn. Iṣẹ́ àkọ́kọ́ tí mo rí gẹ́gẹ́ bí olùkọ́ ní yunifásitì ó jẹ́ nílùú Boston, University of Massachusetts ní Boston. Boston mo wà tí University Alberta tí mo ti ṣetán tí wọ́n fún mi ní iṣẹ́. Mo wá padà sí Canada ní 2013. So èyí túmọ̀ sí pé bí ọdún mọ́kànlá ni mo ti wà ní Canada padà lẹ́yìn ọdún kan tí mo lò ní US. Ní ọdún 2021 ni wọ́n fún mi ní ìgbéga gẹ́gẹ́ bí full professor ní University Alberta níbí. Bí mo ṣe sọ lẹ́ẹ̀kan, Abẹ́òkúta ni mo dàgbà sí. Ilé ẹ̀kọ́ tí a ń pè ní African Church Grammar School ni mo lọ. Àwọn kọ́ wa ní oríṣiríṣi èdè àti àṣà àwọn èèyàn wa. So inú mi dùn láti darapọ̀ mọ́ yín lónìí. Ẹ ṣé púpọ̀ olóòtú.
Kí ni wọ́n jẹ́ gbàgbé lé ò bọ́mọdé ròyìn àṣàkárà nù. Ẹ pé kí ló dé tí mo fi ń kọ orin tí mò ń kọ nígbà tí mo ní wọn ó bẹ̀rẹ̀. Ìgbà tẹ́mi ti rí tí wọ́n ti dì, mo ní èèbó ni wọ́n dà lẹ̀, ṣùgbọ́n wọ́n fi hàn mí pé ojúlówó làwọn. Wọ́n fi hàn mí pé ọmọ ọkọ pàtàkì làwọn. Inú mi dùn o, mo dúpẹ́ púpọ̀ lọ́wọ́ yín. Àwa náà pọ̀ ní ẹ bá wa re. Ẹ jẹ́ kí n ṣe àlàyé fún yín. Àwọn èèyàn jàǹkànjàǹkàn, lákọ̀ọ́kọ́ náà mo kọ́kọ́ fẹ́ dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ bàbá l'Ógbómọ̀ṣọ́, torí Yorùbá sọ wípé ìtọ̀sẹ̀ ló lọ́yọ̀ọ́. Ọpọlọ wọn pé àlejò wa pàtàkì, wọ́n sì dájú, wọ́n dánu. Ṣùgbọ́n èmi ọ̀bá tí mọ̀ wọ́n, èmi ọ̀bá tí rí wọn tí ò bá ṣọpọlọpọ̀ bàbá l'Ógbómọ̀ṣọ́. Èèyàn mélòó mọ̀ níbo mo jáde sí. Nọ́mbà mi ò fi bẹ́ẹ̀ jáde. Tí n bá ti wá fẹ́ kí nọ́mbà mi ó jáde, máa lo ti bàbá l'Ógbómọ̀ṣọ́. Bàbá l'Ógbómọ̀ṣọ́, mo dúpẹ́ púpọ̀ lọ́wọ́ yín. Ẹ ṣeun. Ojú òní yín ti ẹ̀ní tẹ́ ẹ̀ní ṣòwò fún ọmọ ẹlòmíì jẹ. A pọ̀ níbí. Àwọn amòye wa ni mo kọ́kọ́ fẹ́ fi hàn yín. Àwọn amòye wa lórí Yorùbá Gbòde, àwọn tí a máa jíṣẹ́ fún, àwọn ni wọ́n máa rán wa níṣẹ́. Tá a bá sì fàbọ̀, tá a bá dé, àwọn náà ni a fàbọ̀ fún, torí pé ọpọlọ wọn pé bíi kà sí nǹkan. Àwọn ni òpómúléró lórí Yorùbá Gbòde. Àwọn ni èmi máa ń rí tí mo máa ń sọ wípé bí mo bá ti rí ọ lẹ́yìn mi, mo lè gba eégún létí. kódà bí mo rí ọ lẹ́yìn mi mo lè ta àrọ̀nì láyà. Ẹni àkọ́kọ́ irú àwọn èèyàn bẹ́ẹ̀ ni bàbá ní gbọ̀ngàn, àwọn náà ni ọ̀jọ̀gbọ́n Adéníran Adébóyè. Bàbá ẹ̀yin dà, ń bo lẹ́wà o.
Mo wà bí
Àwọn gbogbo èèyàn ká lórí
mo wà bí.
ń táwọn Fúlàní dánwò lónìí nù.
Àti rí bàbá, àti rí.
Ok, ẹ ṣeun. tó àwọn ní ọ̀jọ̀gbọ́n Adéníran Adébóyè, wọ́n yọ̀ǹgì bàjẹ́, ọmọ èké ni wọ́n mi ò rò wọ́n lè ju 38 lọ. Ǹjẹ́ tiẹ̀ tó bẹ́ẹ̀ bàbá?
Gbogbo ni wọ́n ti rí.
Ṣùgbọ́n Ọlọ́run wa kẹ́ wọn dáadáa.
Ẹ ṣeun. Mo ti kí àwọn àlejò wa kẹ́ tó dé. Mo sì ti ṣe àlàyé pé ẹ̀kọ́ ni mo wá kọ́ níbí lónìí, pàápàá lórí ọ̀rọ̀ tí ẹ gbé kalẹ̀ pé a máa jíròrò lórí ẹ̀. So inú mi dùn láti wà bí, mo kí wọn káàbọ̀. Mo dúpẹ́ púpọ̀ wọ́n yọjú sí wa. Ẹ ṣeun.
Ṣé ẹ rí bàbá tí wọ́n sọ̀rọ̀ ọ̀jọ̀gbọ́n ìlú bàbá ìṣirò ni wọ́n. Gbogbo àwọn ọmọ wa pátá tí wọ́n gbòdojú kùpọ̀n lọ lórí ìṣirò, ọpẹ́lọpẹ́ wọn ni wọ́n fi ń tún òdo òun ṣe. Ẹnìkan náà who shall remain nameless, ó sì lè jẹ́ kó náà ní sọ̀rọ̀ ara rẹ̀. Gbòdo lẹ́ẹ̀mẹ́ta lórí kọ́lẹ́jọ jíbrà, nígbà tọ́wọ́ bàbá Adébóyè bá ẹnìkan ọ̀kan tó fi gba bí. Ẹ̀wẹ̀ mi sọ pé èèyàn gbọ́dọ̀ parọ́. Bàbá ni bàbá jẹ́ fún gbogbo wa. Wọ́n ti ṣe alága rí fún ẹgbẹ́ yìí. Ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ nǹkan tí a bá fẹ́ ṣe tó bá ti ta kókó, tá a bá ti rí bàbá, yàtọ̀ fún pé wọ́n ní ọgbọ́n, bàbá tún ní ìmọ̀ dáadáa. Kéèyàn wá pa ọgbọ́n pọ̀lú ìmọ̀ àti òye, wọ́n di ìmọ̀dòye tí wọ́n tún wá ní àgbékalẹ̀. Ọlọ́run ní gba bàbá lọ́wọ́ wa. Bàbá ó pẹ́pẹ́pẹ́. Bàbá mo pé ẹ káàbọ̀ sórí ètò Yorùbá Gbòde. Bákan náà lórí ètò yìí lónìí, amòye wa kejì tí wọ́n fi hàn yín, àwọn náà ni dókítà Olúbíyì Olúwakáyọ̀dé. Mo fẹ́ pe gbogbo ọkọ̀ ọmọ tán ni.
Àkànbí.
Ọmọ Oyèfúlẹ̀.
Ṣé wọn lóríkì ní Àkànbí?
Alága.
Mo ní ṣé wọn lóríkì ní, ẹ jẹ́ ká fún Alákànbí.
Bàbá mi ló jẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ o.
Gbọ̀ngàn bí.
Ọ̀dà ẹgbọ́n wọn ní ẹ̀yà lò ní o, oríkì tá fún yín, oríkì bàbá gbọ̀ngàn ni. Àyà yín lò, ṣùgbọ́n yíyà tẹ́ ẹ bá ti ń san owó rẹ́ǹtì lọ́dọọdún tẹ́ ẹ ti ń san, kódà mo lè ní kẹ́ ẹ lò ní 50 ọdún sí. Dókítà ọlọ́pọlọ.
Ẹ ṣe gan. Thank you lótì o. No, mo ní tẹ́tí yá mi lò yẹn, mi ní yà l'Ógbómọ̀ṣọ́ nìyẹn, Gbọ̀ngàn tààrà ni mò ń lọ.
Torí àwọn Ògbómọ̀ṣọ́ ló dàgbà lọ́wọ́ yín. Ẹ ṣeun. Dókítà ọlọ́pọlọ.
Tó má dẹ̀ fẹ́ kí n lò, ó lè jẹ́ pé 25 years péré tó máa fẹ́ kí n lò ní Ògbómọ̀ṣọ́. So Gbọ̀ngàn yá.
Orí wọn pé, orí dókítà pé bí kàìsí nǹkan, gẹ́gẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ ṣe bọ́tà pè wọ́n ní dókítà ọlọ́pọlọ. Àwọn tí ọpọlọ wọn ò pé, àwọn tí ọpọlọ wọn kù díẹ̀ káàtó, àwọn tí wọ́n gbàgbé ìdajì ọpọlọ sọ́hùn, àwọn ni wọ́n bá wọn ṣe gbogbo.
Àwọn Trump.
Ẹni tí ó kù tí wọ́n rẹ̀ sí nínú. Ṣùgbọ́n ẹ mú gbẹ̀tugbẹ̀tu lọ́jọ́ tí bá ń bọ̀ wá síbi iṣẹ́ yín o.
Lágbára.
Ẹ mú gbẹ̀tugbẹ̀tu lọ o.
Ẹ ṣé gan lótì. Thank you for heading me towards Gbọ̀ngàn. Kíní yìí, ó ti padà. Ó cut off ní bíbá yìí sí ìsìn ni o. Ẹ ṣé ọmọ, mo wà ń bí o. Ẹ ń gbọ́ mi.
À ń gbọ́ yín.
Ok, ẹ ṣé gan.
Gbogbo wa là ń gbọ́ yín.
Thank you.
Kódà bàbá ẹnṣó ẹnu mi wọ̀ lọ́bẹ̀ ìjà ẹnìṣó ńlẹ̀.
No, mo kàn fẹ́ sọ fún Professor Oriola pé ẹ káàbọ̀ o. Thank you very much. A máa kọ́ ẹ̀kọ́ láti ọ̀dọ̀ yín o lénìí. Things nípa Boko Haram were very, very confusing for a lot of people. One young fellow láti northeast of Nigeria, kì í ṣe ní Kanuri land or south of Kanuri land, ó wá sí ilé mi jọ, ó wá try láti explain it for me. This is a humongously intelligent fellow. Ó ṣe specialty training ẹ̀ tán. In fact, ó ṣe fellowship ẹ̀. Ṣe ní medicine. After your specialty, you do fellowship. So ó ṣe fellowship ẹ̀ tán. Just to meet ẹ̀. Very, very knowledgeable. But he was trying to explain it to me and was just too confusing. So if you can, if you are able to explain the dynamics and the going-ons in the northeastern part of Nigeria, as far as Boko Haram is concerned, I'll be very, very happy to learn. Ẹ ṣé gan, ẹ káàbọ̀.
Ẹ ṣeun o, bàbá l'Ógbómọ̀ṣọ́, àwọn náà ni ẹnjiníà àgbà Thomas Oyètúndé Bánkọ́lé. Àwọn ti dábí ẹdùn, wọn ti ṣe oríṣiríṣi nǹkan fún àwọn ọmọ Yorùbá. Ṣé rí bí wọ́n ti jókòó hun? Ọjọ́ mẹ́jọ mẹ́jọ ni wọ́n máa ti Canada wá sáàrin wa báyìí. Canada ni wọ́n ti wá aeroplane wọn èsì depo kèé bá go slow. Iṣẹ́ ńlá ni wọ́n ń ṣe fún wa. Akíkanjú ni wọ́n. Tí a bá ti rí wọn báyìí, a mọ̀ pé òní ò dára. Inú mi dùn láti fi wọ́n hàn yín. Ẹnjiníà Thomas Oyètúndé Bánkọ́lé, ẹ kí àlejò wa.
Ẹ ṣé púpọ̀ olóòtú. Inú mi dùn gidigidi fún àlejò wa tó wá sórí ọpọ́n lónìí. Ó di pẹ́ tí mo ti ń bá wọn sọ̀rọ̀ láti pé kán wá sórí ètò yìí. Torí mo mọ̀ wípé ògúnnágbòǹgbò ni wọ́n nínú ọ̀rọ̀ ètò kí ni Boko Haram bó ló ṣe ń jà sí, bó ló ti wá oríṣiríṣi báwọn yẹn. Gẹ́gẹ́ bá ń ṣe sọ, ńgbà tán júwe ara wọn, àwọn nǹkan kan wà tí wọ́n fi sílẹ̀ tí mi ìbá fẹ́ kán fi ẹnu ara wọn sọ, ni wípé wọ́n ti kọ oríṣiríṣi ìwé pàápàá nínú ìwé ìròyìn ní Nàìjíríà àti níbí lórí Boko Haram, lórí bọ́n ṣe ń jà, lórí bí ó ṣe sí ìṣẹ́gun lórí ọ̀rọ̀ Boko Haram, oríṣiríṣi ni wọ́n ti kọ. And wọ́n dẹ̀ ti jẹ́ olùdámọ̀ràn tá ń pè ní special adviser fún ìjọba wa níbi government of Alberta. Ara recommendations wọn ó jára ń tán adapt nínú legislative laws wọn níbí nípa ọ̀rọ̀ ọlọ́pàá, policing affairs wọn. So wọ́n ti ṣiṣẹ́ gidigidi lọ́rọ̀ criminology and all that area. So inú mi dùn gan ìgbà tá a ní kí wọ́n wá tí wọ́n sì jẹ́ wa nípè. So Professor Oriola, ẹ ṣeun gan, ẹ̀kọ́ ni gbogbo wa kọ́ nípa ọ̀rọ̀ Boko Haram. Bó la ṣe fẹ́ ṣẹ́gun àwọn Boko Haram? Kí ló fà á tá a rí ṣẹ́gun látọjọ́ yìí? Ẹ jọ àwọn nǹkan tá a fẹ́ gbọ́ ni ẹ ṣeun gan.
Ẹ ṣé gan ni sà.
So èmi tí mo wà ní Ṣọlá Yusuf ní orúkọ mi. Èmi ni ọmọ kẹyìn wọn léńjé bó ti wà nínú Ifá. Èmi ni mo wà ní ẹ̀yìn wọn, ọlá wọn ni èmi náà fi ń dún, tí mo fi ń dábí ẹ̀dùn, tí mo fi ń rọ̀ bí òwe. Ṣọlá Yusuf ní orúkọ mi, oníròyìn fún ní orílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà lọ́dún kànrin kése. Ṣe rí n tó ṣe wá, n tó lé wa sí wálẹ̀ yìí, ó jogun lọ. Àwa náà yá a họ bí àṣà barista, ó ní mo họ, mo yá a họ. Nígbà tí àmọ́ bá ti ṣe gbogbo ẹ̀ mọ́, a wá dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ Ọlọ́run pé ilẹ̀ tí a dé. Lónìí mo fẹ́ kí ẹ ṣàlàyé fún wa dáadáa nípa àwọn oníjàádì tí àwọn eléèbó ń pè ní terrorism. Àwọn terrorism táwà nílẹ̀ tiwa, àwọn Boko Haram ni. Mo ń bẹ́nìkan sọ̀rọ̀ ní àná nípa ẹ̀kọ́ mi, mo wá ń ṣàlàyé fún ẹni yẹn pé ǹjẹ́ o mọ̀ pé Boko Haram tí wọ́n sọ pé wọ́n kó wá yìí, èmi ò mọ ibi tí ìdánilẹ́kọ̀ọ́ yín ó dorí kọ o ṣùgbọ́n tèmi mọ̀ ni pé ó ti bẹ̀rẹ̀ láti àárín àwa Yorùbá wàláì tàlà ìsúnmọ́bí láì ó ti bẹ̀rẹ̀ torí ẹjọ́ ìṣẹ́jọ́ ti ẹni ká mọ̀mọ́ dá ṣé ẹ mọ̀ pé àwọn Bándélé bàbá Adébóyè ọmọ wọn àwọn Bándélé sect àwọn ẹlẹ́sìn mùsùlùmí kan tí wọ́n yàtọ̀ ní wọ́n wà ní Nàìjíríà tí wọ́n bá ti wá ń bọ̀ tó bá ti ìgbà tí tán bá ń ṣe àjọ̀dún àbí nǹkan kan bẹ́yìn wọ́n á máa sọ pé ọmọ mi kò ní rèé gbé láyéláyé ilé ìwé ni wọ́n ń pè ní ilé ègbé ọmọ mi kò ní rèé ìwé láyé ọmọ wọn á máa kọrin yẹn káàkiri àdúgbò èyí ò nìkan kan wọ́n tún wá máa ń kọ orin kan gbà náà láti fi kí àwọn èèyàn má bàa rán ọmọ wọn nílé ẹ̀kọ́ wọn á ní ọmọ tó yẹ kó kéwú iléèwé ò jẹ ọmọ tó yẹ kó kírun iléèwé ò jẹ bíwé báwé mọ̀mọ́ lẹ̀ Kúránì ló lè tú bíwé báwé mọ̀mọ́ lẹ̀ Kúránì ló lè tú ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn èèyàn ni wọ́n torí orin tí wọ́n lọ yọ àwọn ọmọ wọn kúrò ní sùkúù ẹ rí i pé Boko Haram kan nu ẹ dákun ẹ wá bá wa ṣàlàyé ẹ rí orin lásán lèmi lè kọ ohun ọmọdé orin lọ gbogbo òtàn tí ń bẹ ń bẹ ẹ̀yin lẹ ní ẹ wá bá wa ṣe àlàyé kí ló ń jẹ́ Boko Haram kí gbogbo àwọn terrorism yẹn ẹ bá wa tú dáadáa ká lè bá a mọ bá a ṣe mú wọn ẹ ṣé mo dúpẹ́ ọgbọ́n yín ò ní dópin.
Ami. I'm going to start with the two terms, Boko Haram. Boko means book. Haram means forbidden, as we all know. Now, that has often been literally translated to mean that Western education is forbidden, that Boko Haram, essentially means that Western education is forbidden. Now, that is one interpretation, and in my opinion, an incomplete interpretation of the meaning of Boko Haram. Boko Haram goes beyond opposition to Western education. Boko Haram essentially is opposition to Western culture, lifestyle, and civilization. So essentially, we're dealing with a civilizational struggle. I won't use the term clash of civilizations, but it is definitely a civilizational struggle. So the opposition is much more deep-seated than opposing Western education and what that stands for. It's much broader than that. Now, to understand Boko Haram, we have to go back in time to the belief in millenarian movements. And the idea being that after every 100 years, there's the belief that God would send a Mahdi, a savior, to the people. Now, when you go back even to British occupation of northern Nigeria, for example, you find all manners of struggle over there in northern, what is now northern Nigeria. One of that was the Satiru Rebellion back in 1906, which pitted certain elements within the village of Satiru against the traditional ruler and invariably against the British colonialists. Now, as part of this successive waves, so in the north, there have always been successive waves of jihadists, as we now call them, or social movements of a religious kind, professing to be the true standard bearers of religion. In other words, they would rail against existing systems, the corruption, and so on, and claim that they are the authentic purveyors of true Islam, and that every other thing was haram, and they would engage in takfir or excommunication of the present-day leaders and so on. Now, many of us in this gathering would remember Mated Sine, for example, Mohammed Marwa, the one who curses who had been deported to Cameroon multiple times because he was not Nigerian, but succeeded in galvanizing several people and against the government, the police, burning homes, burning police vehicles and stations and so on and so forth. Now, my point in going into all of that is to give just a glimpse of how historical this is. This did not start with Boko Haram. Boko Haram is simply one of the most recent manifestations of centuries of descent from below society, descent from the ground up, from the grassroots in northern Nigeria. It has often had religious coloration, but it has also always been explicitly political, because it wasn't just always about patterns of worship or what constituted through Islam. It was also about political governance. It was also about social inequality and what have you. So distribution of resources and so on. Now, but Boko Haram is easily one of its most virulent forms, in part because of its splintering. So we know that Ansaru, for example, has emerged from Boko Haram. ISWAP, or the Islamic State West Africa province, has also emerged from Boko Haram. And of course, those dimensions have meant multiple folds of violence in northern Nigeria, especially the northeast, and then on to the north central. And then they've also spoken of plans to go south in their plans before some of the more serious anti-terrorist policies were introduced. Now, so essentially this began as a small religious group that began to grow. And the leaders were offering interest-free loans to members, buying the motorcycles, preaching about, again, through Islam and all of that, and began to grow, because, again, you're talking about fundamentally socioeconomically deprived region in northeast Nigeria, and specifically Borno State, where it began in the early 2000s. So there's agreement in the scholarly discourse around the development of Boko Haram in 2001, 2002 is believed to be around the period when it emerged in its current format. Now, the security services that we now know as DSS were relatively aware of what was going on and had sent operatives to go look at what was going on. But as a result of intelligence failure and leaks, and quite bluntly, divided loyalties in the part of the security agencies, what was essentially a small ragtag group of religious zealots was allowed to metastasize into its current form. Now, state repression also played a major role into the making of Boko Haram. As many of you may recall, in 2009, Boko Haram was involved in confrontations with the police. They burned police stations, they killed police officers, and were essentially running roughshod over the police. The military were invited in July of 2009 to take over that issue in Borno State. And of course, Mohammed Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, was arrested. And there are till this day pictures of Mohammed Yusuf after his arrest by the military. The military handed him over to the Nigerian police force. Within 24 to 48 hours, by several available records, Mohammed Yusuf was killed in police custody. And by the reckoning of multiple panels set up by various levels of government, he was murdered extrajudicially without the benefit of a trial and all of that. Now, Mohammed Yusuf was not the only one who died or was killed in July 2009. Several of his followers, hundreds of his followers, were also massacred. First in the attempt to quash that group by the military, but also in reprisal attacks, in other words, revenge attacks by state forces, in this case, the Nigerian police force. Now, one of the core elements of this would then begin to play out. Now, the remnants of what was left of Boko Haram went underground following that extrajudicial killing. And they re-emerged in 2010 under a new leadership. And that gave us what we now know as Boko Haram in its current form. Again, while they had excesses, they were already burning houses, attacking police and all of that. But in terms of its metamorphosis into a full-blown terrorist organization, the research around this is fairly clear and incontrovertible. State repression played a fundamental role in that transition from a ragtag group, violent nonetheless, but in terms of its metamorphosis into a full-blown terrorist organization, state repression was a catalytic element in the making of that. Now, the other element, of course, is the breakdown of trust between citizens and state forces or the government writ large. Now, citizens, of course, have to make rational calculations. You have to think about their positionality and so forth. So the loyalties, therefore, were divided such that these individuals were able to be part of the civilian population in minutes after attacks, for example. Now, I mean, because, of course, they were living amongst people who were not willing to give them up, either because they're afraid, either because they are also individuals with grievances with the government and so forth. That allowed the group to begin to grow in leaps and bounds, and hence the need for any government to be able to prove and demonstrate its relevance in the lives of its people. And so in the regions where rural areas where Boko Haram grew, there was very little governmental presence. And so by providing soft loans, interest-free loans, motorcycles, helping people start small-scale businesses and all of that, Boko Haram was buying the loyalty of people in those rural areas and was essentially delivering in a region where the government had failed at all levels. And that played a major role in the emergence of Boko Haram. Now, the other part of it, of course, is endemic poverty. Now, I cannot say enough about that. It's spectacular levels of deprivation in that region. And that meant that while in terms of recruitment, Boko Haram would eventually be going to kidnapping, for example, to recruit people to be suicide bombers and be foot soldiers, domestic servants, and so on. One of the least spoken aspect of Boko Haram's recruitment is voluntary enlistment in Boko Haram, where folks, for various reasons, some as a result of grievances, so some of those I interviewed. Part of what I should have mentioned earlier is that for my new book published by Oxford University Press in April of this year, I interviewed over 170 individuals, including military generals, rank and file soldiers, who had been deployed at least once in the war against Boko Haram. I also interviewed activists within the Bring Back Our Girls movement, a group formed to fight for the rescue of the Chibok girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram back in April of 2014, as many of you may remember. Now, what all of the pieces of evidence that I gathered pointed to, whether that was the top-ranking generals or rank and file soldiers deployed in the war theater in the Northeast, was that the endemic poverty in the North played into Boko Haram's hands because you had people who were unable to be unwilling to be interpellated or in what was going on, either by conspiratorial silence or active participation. Gun runners, a lot of folks who are helping to supply Boko Haram with weapons, with bullets, with food, and other forms of logistics are regular, everyday people that you would ordinarily not suspect of being involved in any way with a terrorist group. Now, so those are some of the more immediate causes. Now, at a sort of deeper and elite level, you have the politicization of the issue. The Boko Haram issue became political football in the Nigerian political system. Now, the issue was weaponized and instrumentalized by political elites. Now, the generals I interviewed around 2015 and 2016, for example, particularly those amongst them who were some of the leading folks in the twilight years of the President Goodluck Jonathan administration, did say that there was clear evidence from their own experiences that some of their own colleagues in the top echelon of the Nigerian military who believed that a resurgent and vibrant Boko Haram would be beneficial to the electoral chances of then presidential candidate General Muhammadu Buhari. And so they were working directly and indirectly to ensure Buhari's victory. And that was by essentially either directly sabotaging the efforts of the Jonathan administration to defeat Boko Haram, or by simply offering very little by way of their expertise and support. And that meant that the war against Boko Haram expanded, again, because it was seen, a vibrant Boko Haram was seen as beneficial to the electoral chances of Buhari. That is a fundamental element of the making of Boko Haram in its current trajectory. Now, and of course, this generals also spoke to intelligence leaks in the military. And some of you may also recall that in January of 2012, President Goodluck Jonathan did say to the world that there were Boko Haram elements in his government, that they were in the judiciary and they were in the National Assembly, they were in his cabinet, and that was not an exaggeration. Although some of his handlers tried to walk back some of those comments, but he was speaking his truth in that moment. Because in fact, one pattern that emerged, according to some of the generals I spoke with, one of whom was essentially the face of the Jonathan administration's response to Boko Haram, was that every time they had new supplies of weapons and ammunition at specific locations, within days, Boko Haram was tracked those areas and not other areas that didn't get supplies. And that for him, what it revealed was that they could not trust the military of that period. And that was the moment where they began to consult with private military mercenaries, especially from South Africa, to help Nigeria in the war against Boko Haram. And you may recall that a number of South Africans died in the war against Boko Haram as private soldiers, and the South African government issued a directive that their citizens should not go and fight in the war against Boko Haram. Now, so my point is that at the grassroots level, you had complicity, you had silence, either out of fear, but also a level of grievance against a state that had no bearing on their lives, whose presence they never saw, and that was seen as very distant and irrelevant to their day-to-day lives. Is, of course, the undercurrents of religion. And so some of those who would later start condemning Boko Haram did not do so initially when it seemed that those that Boko Haram attacked were the infidels. But when Boko Haram started going into other places of worship, then people began to condemn it. Now, in General Minima, during his pull-out parade following his retirement, did speak to some of those issues, that if we had all spoken in unity, rather than politicize Boko Haram, rather than turn it into an ethnic thing, it would have been different. So when it seemed that they were just attacking enemies of the land, then it was fine. But by the time the Boko Haram democratized, for lack of a better term, its attacks, then condemnations grew. Now, the role played by sabotage is huge. Everything from intelligence leaks to soldiers, Nigerian trained soldiers, switching sides to Boko Haram because Boko Haram could pay more money to those individuals. And that also included the civilian joint task force that was formed, for which in my interviews with the rank and file soldiers who had been deployed for at least up to 6 months in the war against Boko Haram found to, while some were occasionally helpful, but they could also be deadly because they could lead you to a trap, and that they lost people that way. Again, keep in mind these are regular members of society who volunteer or were recruited to help the military in its war against Boko Haram. Now, the other thing I would mention is troop morale. That has been incredibly poor. I visited the war theater twice in the course of research for my book. And it was very clear that morale was very low. Everything from poor salaries and allowances, delayed allowances, or when allowances were paid, you might discover that it is lower than what was promised to the troops in writing. And so all of this began to play a major role. There were soldiers that I interviewed who had been told they were going on a peacekeeping mission in another country, but then found out that they were in Northeast Nigeria. So all kinds of deceits and all of that. So the morale level became very, very low. Now, while senior officers, generals, and those immediately below them were lobbying to go to the war theater in the Northeast to fight Boko Haram, and because of the resources they could gather and the funds, well, that they could make. For the rank and file soldiers, non-commissioned soldiers, it was tragic as far as they were concerned to be posted there. It was a sign of bad fortune to be posted to fight Boko Haram. Now, a lot of figures are often quoted about the number of troops in the war theater and all of that. Part of what I found in the course of my research was that some of those numbers were in fact bogus. They were merely avenues to siphon money. So they might say they have 10,000 soldiers on the ground in a particular location. In reality, there may not be more than 5,000. But somebody somewhere, a small group of people somewhere were collecting the salaries and allowances of the extra 5,000 that were essentially ghost soldiers. So that handicapped the troops. That meant that they were not as large a fighting force as was being advertised. Now, the poor welfare of troops also played a role. Now, while in my findings and in my publications, I did mention how it seemed that many of those soldiers were ready to fight. They were ready to lay down their lives for their country. They were also not pleased with the way that their fallen comrades were being treated, and their families in particular, so that in some cases, within 2-3 months of the deaths of those soldiers in battle, their families would be thrown out of the barracks and would become homeless, or their allowances, their salaries would be stopped. Now, if you're in the war front, you're hearing about the treatment of somebody who died beside you 2 months ago, and that would kill your morale. And so, and in one of my publications in the journal African Affairs, published by Cambridge University Press, I make a point about what the soldiers called a rubbish mission. In Yoruba, I think the appropriate word would be rede rede, ogun rede rede, like this is just nonsense. That they were being called, they were being deployed to fight a nonsensical war. And the soldiers were also deeply suspicious about the sponsors of Boko Haram. They suspected that Boko Haram was being sponsored, was being used for political purposes by politicians, and that top generals in the army were milking Boko Haram. Again, our defense budget ballooned. All kinds of billions and billions of naira got deployed in the fight against Boko Haram, and many senior generals, not all, but a good number, became rich overnight, and even some relatively junior officers. I have a retired general on record who informed me that at one point, General Tukur Buratai, who was Chief of Army Staff at the time, ordered in writing that anybody below the rank of a colonel must not drive an SUV in the barracks, because those who were returning from the war theater in the Northeast began to drive huge vehicles, bigger than what their senior colleagues had driven. That then came out this scramble to be posted to the war theater. Again, that's for the commissioned people, the more senior people. Whereas for the rank and file, they felt like it was almost like a death sentence to them if you ever get posted. So there was that dichotomy in terms of experiences for a lot of the senior people. This was a good money-making machinery, which is not to say they were all corrupt. The corruption was very, very rampant. In one of my publications, I documented up to 10 different forms of corruption in the war against Boko Haram, everything from inflation of the troops, number of the troops, supplies of uniforms and boots and so on, supplies of weapons and all of that, to the food and water and the racketeering that went on around that, and other logistical avenues that provided a way to make money in the war against Boko Haram. Now, the other thing I would say, and then I should pause and take questions, concerns the politicization of the military in and of itself in a way that spoke to nepotism. Now, one very good example would be the Lieutenant General Ibrahim Atahiru, as many of you may know, who died in a plane crash in May of 2021. He was appointed Chief of Army Staff in January 2021, died barely 5 months later in a plane crash. Now, General Atahiru is relevant in this conversation because his predecessor as Chief of Army Staff, General Tukur Ibrahim, had sanctioned him, removed him from his command post for gross incompetence in the war against Boko Haram. Yet, less than 2 years later, that same general became the successor of the general who sanctioned him. So the quote-unquote incompetent person succeeded the guy who sanctioned him for incompetence. Now, and in the journal Armed Forces and Society, I theorize some of these issues, and it's what I call the civilian military leadership interest convergence thesis. And one of the propositions in that theory is that more often than not, at least in countries with a history of coups and counter coups, the chiefs of Army staff, naval staff, Air Force, and so forth, the top military brass, are rarely the brightest and the best. They hold their positions to ethnic, geographic, linguistic, and religious affinity with the government of the day. And that plays a role because they are not selecting the best brains. And I think this one instance in particular is a prime example of what happens when you deploy those who should not be in those roles. The current vice president is in fact on record when he was governor of Borno State, Shatima, I believe is his name, indicating that when certain individuals were put in certain roles, the war against Boko Haram did not go well. Partly because they didn't want to deal with folks with whom they shared cultural affinity, but also because they just were not the best who should have been selected for those roles. So the Nigerian society and the Nigerian military and the Nigerian army in particular are all paying a massive price for the failure to select the best and the brightest. The extreme levels of nepotism, especially under the Buhari administration, played a major role in the metastasis of Boko Haram and the way that it has morphed into what it is today. Now, in terms of the broader issues, of course, the level of education, and in the region, and the disconnect between the people and the state, these are all major issues at play and that have to be addressed if we're going to make any progress on defeating Boko Haram. I will pause there and welcome your questions and comments.
Olótù, ṣé wà ń bẹ̀?
You're muted, Ma, if you're speaking.
Baba Adébóyè.
I didn't know that I had cut my microphone off. Please forgive me. So for our people that are just coming in, as a reminder again, we are talking about Boko Haram. And our special guest has given us everything that we need to know about these people, but still we will still ask questions. Before I'm going to yield to the our wise men to ask their questions first, or comment, or anything that they want to add to this important lecture. Baba Adeboye, over to you, sir. Or you want somebody to come first?
It doesn't matter, but I certainly want to thank Professor Oriola for giving us the kuli or Boko Haram. The way that I certainly didn't understand it before. Not that I understood a whole lot, so I really got a lot added to myself listening to him. The other leaders might have questions that are very specific to Boko Haram. So I will urge them to ask those questions first. I have certain questions of which Boko Haram is only a piece, and I would love to be able to ask them without interfering or diluting what people may have in their mind about Boko Haram. So let's pass over to the other two gentlemen. Then I want to come back and ask some very broad questions.
Okay, sir. Okay. Is anybody want to go from or can I go? Baba, Dr. Olopolo, where are you?
Olopolo, quickly.
Olopolo. Baba Olopolo, mbole lọ lánàá, òde àná dùn. Okay. Okay. Okay, let me. Well, I'm going to ask one or two questions. So my question is, if things get better, let's say by miracle, our economy improves from the south to the north, and we are getting what we didn't get before, do you think Boko Haram could be history, that we won't even hear about it anymore? That is one thing. Then my second question is there anything at all apart from money that can take away these terrible people from our midst, one way or the other? Yes, sir, that's it. Those are my questions.
All right. Thank you for your questions. I appreciate them. In terms of the economy and Boko Haram, the economy is just a part of a broader constellation of issues that help to produce Boko Haram. So and a change in the economy should improve the situation. They may have problems recruiting, for example, but it will not totally wipe away Boko Haram. It may also not totally wipe away another millenarian movement. Keep in mind, I started off by talking about the Satiru rebellion, the belief that every 100 years that God sends a Mahdi, a savior. That is ingrained in religion and culture and mentality. That is not likely to go away anytime soon, even if the economy improves. To be clear, the economy will help. It will reduce some of the recruitment drives, for example, of Boko Haram, and some of the attractions to Boko Haram, at least in the earlier stages, and the loans they were giving, buying motorcycles for people, giving money for business and all of that. So if the economy improves, all of those would likely fade. But the more sedimented non-economic variables would still be there. It's religious, it's cultural, it's ingrained in the system. Those are not going away. But yes, improving the economy should really hit them in terms of recruitment. That should go down. Is there anything apart from money that can make this group go away? So we need to do many things for this to become history. And olóòtú ẹ̀kọ́ orin kan lẹ́ẹ̀kan nípa àwọn tó ní pé àwọn ọ̀ràn ọmọ wọn lọ léèwé nǹkan kan. Ẹ̀kọ́ yẹn ṣe pàtàkì gan torí ó pẹ̀lú nǹkan tó ṣokùnfà nǹkan tá à ń sọ yìí ní North East Nigeria. The attitude to Western style education has to change. And keep in mind, I said Western style, not Western necessarily. That has to change. We're talking about a region, and we can add the Northwest to that, so the Northeast and Northwest of Nigeria. Over 60% of women under the age of 18 have already had their first kids. So you're talking about people ages 15 to roughly 17 who are already mothers. And their proportion in the population is over 60% of women or of females in the population. So what that means is that you have roughly half the population that is not living out its true potentials. That would have to be addressed. And if you've ever been to the North, and I imagine there are people on this call who have been to the North, and you see rows and rows of Almajiri kids on the streets begging with those bowls. Now, that's a recruitment ground, and we've got to do something about it. And part of what to do about it is to enroll those kids in school. They don't all have to necessarily have university degrees, but they should at least have a level of lettering, being able to read and write in any language, whether that's Hausa, whether that's Arabic, whether that's English, and should also, by all means, have some kind of skills. That is absolutely fundamental. Now, there also has to be some sort of elite consensus in the North amongst the governors of the North and their local government chairpersons to stop subsidizing behavior that creates more problems for the North. One of those is those mass weddings. They are great politically if you're seeking votes and so forth, but in terms of statecraft, you're misleading the people. Where in one of my favorite examples comes from a young man who participated in one of those mass weddings in Kano. He was roughly 23 and was at that mass wedding a few years ago to marry his second wife. He had no employment, he had no education, he had no skills of any kind. That
and his second wife.
Yes, and he was in that wedding to marry his second wife.
Very sad.
So these are all part of the issues where, and we do talk about it, but I think the elites have to reach some kind of consensus and help the people and help themselves as well.
That's right.
Because these issues are not going away, and they are contributing to it through, admittedly, some of these popular programs. These are not some wacky politicians. These are people who they have grassroots support. Part of that is that they do some of these programs that the people love, but it doesn't mean it's good for the people. It's poison to the people because you're creating problems for future generations. And this is a part of the issue. Now, tied to that is poverty alleviation. That has to be a part of the broader landscape. And that would need a level of empowerment of both women and men. That has to go hand in hand. The notion of keeping women illiterate or uneducated, unemployed, and totally away from the socio-economic and political sphere is alien to the religion of Islam. I am not an expert on Islam, but the little that I know of it, if you look at other countries around the world that are Muslim majority countries, whether that is Egypt, whether that is Iran, whether that is Saudi Arabia, these things are strange to the religion in and of itself. And so we've got to, at a certain point, reach a decision on this to recognize that this is an adulteration. This is not what the religion preaches. And it's just been used over the years as an excuse. Education is key in Islam. And part of the teaching, in fact, is that wherever you need to get to, whether that's China to acquire education, you should. And so all of these exclusionary practices that we've taken as part of the religion is in fact unfair to the religion. These are the ways of the people, sedimented ways of doing things that are being taken as part of religion. But they do have to be looked into if there's going to be any change in the society.
Before we go to other people, this question is, is like mind, bugging for me. Islam technically came from Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And it went through different routes to different places. So now the people, they are Saudi Arabians, they are spending lots and lots of money now to have relationship with other countries on education. For example, they spend so much money in Nigeria. They gave a scholarship in Greek, in technology, in everything, not only on Islamic education. They do it across the board, Western education and all that. Now, they didn't say book should be forbidden. What they gave it to the northerners, some of them are using it for Boko Haram. Why is it easy or possible for that to happen? Because they gave it to, it came from them, and they still respect Western education. Why is it that this Boko Haram, they are not doing the same thing? Is there something else that is completely different from religion that is pushing these Boko Haramers, like I would call them?
Yeah, it's in simple terms, politics. Politics is driving that narrative, and of course, as we know, even in regions where the level of education is very low, Northeast, Northwest being the two prime examples, in Nigeria, and to a lesser extent, the North Central. Somehow the elites manage to give excellent Western-style education to their kids, including sending them to major world capitals, and whether that's DC or London, and so on and so forth. But the same set of people would not extend much of that, at least most of them, not all, to the masses. My understanding is that the late President Yaradua did quite a lot in terms of education when he was governor of Katsina. But he would be part of a relatively small minority that went out of their way to essentially socialize Western style education. They say, look, this is a priority. We must make this a priority. As people from Southwest Nigeria, as descendants of Oduduwa, I think we owe much of our Western style education prowess to the late sage, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, and that policy of free education. Now, why is that relevant to this discussion? Well, it is relevant because so you had a political class that recognized the significance of Western style education and put their resources into it, made it a priority. But you also had the mass of the people who bought into it, who were mobilized by the elites and participated very strongly in it. Some people selling their farm produce and so on, to send their children to school. When I was conducting research on my very first book many years ago in the Niger Delta, it lived very briefly in Bayelsa. And on my way from Bayelsa to Benin City, I had an interview to conduct there. I took a cab, and everybody in the cab was from the Niger Delta, and they began conversing in a mix of English and Pidgin. And they held the Yoruba people in an exemplary way, talking about how Yoruba parents could sell their land or their clothes or any valuable to send their kids to school.
Yes.
That's important. And it gave me insight into how other parts of the country saw Yoruba people. I was, if I'm being honest, I was very proud. I don't consider myself an ethnic chauvinist, but in that moment, I really must say I was very, very proud. And we must not underestimate the significance of that. Not what those Bayelsans said, but the fact that our people will go out of their way to make sure that their kids are educated. That is important. And any society that refuses to educate its citizens is not ready for progress. Any society, in the second layer to that, any society that thinks it can develop by excluding half of its population because of the agenda is a joke. They're not ready to develop. And so those are the issues. These are multifaceted matters. And each angle has to be taken care of to address this problem. So while this is a security matter, but the security angle is in fact just one facet of a multi-dimensional problem.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to Baba Logbomoso. Do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Olotu. I've been listening with rapt attention to Professor Uriola's lecture. Thank you very much, Professor, for all you have said. I appreciate the level of intelligence brought into this discussion. Now, I'm just thinking, looking at what's happening up north. At age 3, age 4, a parent will just give a ball to a kid and let them out and won't even ask about their whereabouts anymore. I mean, such things don't happen in the Southwest. And we say we're in the same country. Is it possible for us to develop in the South and not have any bearing on the North? I mean, if the North is not developing and we call ourselves the same country, is there a possibility that they would hinder our own development in the Southwest or South? That's my first question. Now, I want to bring in my observation. There was a time I was in Nigeria when Buhari was in power. And Haram at that time was at its infancy. And Buhari was always on their side. No, Buhari wasn't in power then. Jonathan was in power then. And Buhari was kind of defending them saying that whoever touches Boko Haram touches the heart of the North because they are fighting for their rights.
Because it's a bitch.
If they had allowed this thing to be nipped in the bud at that time, I believe we won't be where we are today.
At all.
But Buhari vehemently opposed anything that would, that will stop Boko Haram from growing at that time. And not only that, the present vice president, at that time, I think he was a governor or something. And we all know how much he did to sabotage the efforts of the then federal government by Jonathan. They actually, they didn't hide anything. They did it and overtly to show that they didn't want any crushing of Boko Haram because Boko Haram was useful to them at that time. So see where we are today. And when we have people like Shetima in power, who was part of all these things, where is the will to actually conquer Boko Haram? How much can the federal government do? How much can they do to conquer Boko Haram the way we are now? I mean, it's impossible for Tinubu to do much, because just like Jonathan said that there were Boko Haram people in his government, in his cabinet, in his government and everything. Are you telling me there are no Boko Haram in Tinubu's government? They are all there. All those people who go around in Babariga, they are all Boko Haram agents.
That's right.
So are we not deceiving ourselves if we say we want to remain in the same country and progress? Where's the progress coming from?
Right.
Professor.
Yeah, thank you, Baba. I say, Goni.
So sad.
These are very weighty questions. I will respond in the order in which you asked the two questions. Now, the Almajiri system, I think with all due respect, is being recognized for what it has become. An aberration to learning of religion, and one that has also been polluted by parental neglect. This is not the way it is done, even in countries that are nearly 100% Muslim.
That's right.
It is alien, and wherever and however that began, it has lost favor. And there's a need to retrace that and stop destroying the futures of many, many generations of young Northerners. So that's a first point, because those children did not ask to be born. They did not ask to be through that. When you're 4, 5, 6 years old and you're deployed in that manner, it's not really your fault, and you're left to the elements to fend for yourself and beg and collect money for some Malam who may not even have the training to be able to teach anybody any kind of Quranic education. In terms of development, but you tied that to development quite appropriately. Now, even as we speak, if southern Nigeria were an independent country, it would be close to being a middle-income country even now. If Southwest Nigeria were an independent country, you're talking about an entity that would be close to being a solidly middle-income country. Even now, and with the fall of the naira, that might change and all that, but you get the point. Developmentally, we are not crazily far off from say Botswana, which is a solidly middle-income country on the African continent and has a history of peaceful transfer of power. And it's very rarely in the news because, well, it's doing well and it's in Africa. So yes, my broader point is that there is such a thing as diffusion of social problems. Your safety, your security and well-being can sometimes be shaped by the security of your neighbors. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you should try and help out. If the fire service isn't showing up quickly, out of rational self-interest, because if it's not contained, it's a question of how it is coming to you. So there is right. Diffusion of social problems is a real thing, and I think we're seeing that already with hundreds and hundreds of northern youth. No employment, no skills, no education, thinking that yes, if they could just go to the South, especially the Southwest, they may be able to make something of their lives. And yes, this is a free, independent country. In theory, all citizens are able to move around. There is freedom of movement that is guaranteed in the Nigerian Constitution. But there have also been some of them who have been apprehended with weapons of all kinds in those massive trucks, again, on their way to the South, Lagos in particular, and have been arrested by security agents because of, well, there wasn't any certainty about what they had in mind, what they were going to do with those weapons. So that is one point, that yes, the development of the South can be affected by what goes on elsewhere. Now, keep in mind that the rail system, for example, until towards the end of the Buhari administration, was an exclusive list. In other words, the exclusive reserve of the federal government. Therefore, to even create a railway service from Ekiti State to Lagos, you needed the federal government to agree to it. That has changed. And that's why you see what is being done in Lagos. You see what the Southwest states are now planning in terms of, now I know that Odua investment, or what is left of it, is now trying to ensure that all the Southwest states come together and do an interstate rail service amongst themselves. That came up, I believe, a year or 2 years ago. If your neighbors are not doing well, it is a question of time, especially in terms of mass production of children who are not given any chance in life and are produced in huge numbers. And yeah, that will affect every other neighboring region. So that's the first part. The second part is Buhari's defense of Boko Haram. Now, Buhari was playing opposition politics. And as I argue somewhere in my new book, he knew better, but was doing that as a way of ingratiating himself to his supporters in the north. And yes, much of the activity at the time that the military engaged in was criticized by Buhari. And Buhari's statement to Jonathan was that, well, the former president, Yaradua, gave the Niger Delta insurgents amnesty. You should give Boko Haram amnesty as well. This was his initial take. He was also named by Boko Haram as one of their negotiators with the federal government at one point.
Oh, rubbish.
His stance began to change when he survived a bombing incident in Kaduna, if my memory serves me well. This was when he realized they might come for him. And of course, by the time he took over power, he realized he had the responsibility to the country in terms of tackling what was already a terrorist organization. So I think there was opposition politics in what he said. There was also a degree of parochialism, for which he was very well known as an incredibly ethnocentric individual. None of this is new. But again, coming into power, I think, of course, the arms and ammunition ordered during the Jonathan administration, the twilight of the Jonathan administration began to arrive. And so when he took over, all of those began to help in terms of reducing some of the casualties. And when you look at the graphs of the killings and bombings and so forth carried out by Boko Haram, a decline began around that period. Now, Kenneth Minima, former Chief of Army Staff, put it brilliantly during his pulling out ceremony as he was exiting the military, that if we had all come together as one country to fight this problem, it would not have gotten to the level that it did. And it's interesting that that came from General Kenneth Minima, because General Kenneth Minima was subsequently indicted for corruption, for stealing billions and billions of naira earmarked for purchase of military equipment. So you had somebody who had an understanding of the issue, but still soiled his hands. These are the kinds of people who have managed the system. They identified the problem. They knew what it was, but were also part of the problem because of their own pockets. You referenced the current VP, Vice President Kashim Shettima, and yes, he was governor of Borno State, I believe, for 2 terms. And yes, he gave the Jonathan administration a lot of runaround with respect to Boko Haram. Keep in mind, Boko Haram is fundamentally a Kanuri insurgency. The Kanuris began Boko Haram. And in fact, at one point when Boko Haram began deploying suicide bombers for the very first time in 2011, a couple of years later, they began to run out of people to deploy because nobody wanted to die. And by 2014, i.e. within a space of 3 years, they began to deploy females, including a young girl as young as 7 years on record. So, and part of what came up, that is relevant because part of what came up was that some of the non-Kanuris in Boko Haram began to complain that only non-Kanuris were being deployed as suicide bombers for Boko Haram. So they had an ethnic problem. So But Kashim Shettima, again, the politics of it, the optics and so forth, he was APC, Jonathan was PDP. There were those tensions. And of course, the federal government was lackadaisical. Initially, they did not believe the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, for example, happened. And Jonathan did not speak publicly about that kidnapping until nearly 3 weeks after the kidnapping incident. So you're talking about multifaceted failures at all levels and a poor understanding of statecraft, what it means to be a government, what it means to govern, what citizenship means, and what the duty of the government is to its people. I think you have political power holders who went into it because, well, power would feel good and because of the resources they could take out of it, but with very little and extremely minimal understanding of what to do with political power. I was on a panel a couple of years back with Professor Toyin Falola, and the guest was the former INEC chairman. I forget his name now. This is the person who was INEC chairman during the Jonathan administration. Jega, yes, Professor Jega. And he made a similar point about Northerners in particular seeking power and not knowing what to do with power. You've got to have plans. Governance cannot just be had and mixed. You've got to, people sit down, people strategize, you get a team together to help you think. That's how you mentioned my special advisory role earlier. Part of what I did as special advisor for the government of Alberta was to co-facilitate multiple public engagement sessions to listen to people, whether that was Black Lives Matter, whether that was Indigenous peoples, addiction services people, youth services people, Muslim Albertans, rural Albertans, nearly 24 engagement sessions with different groups, LGBTQIA2S+, name it. We met with them. What do you think about this? And we had prompt questions and so forth, but we had ample time for them to tell us what. So my recommendations were in fact informed by my personal research, the state of the scholarly literature in general, but also the findings of those engagement sessions, notes of which were provided to me by government officials who were taking notes. So I looked at all of those and crafted those recommendations that you spoke about. And then, of course, proposals were then made, and then of course, some of those, not all, but several of those recommendations were then included in the bill, and that was eventually passed. Again, this was a conservative government, so they didn't, in my opinion, go as far enough as I would have loved them to do, but it was still remarkable that a conservative government would do that. My point is, nobody knows it all. When you're in government, you've got to consult. You've got to have the right folks in place who have no skin in the fight and will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, and offer you unbiased, objective analysis. So I think this is a basic misunderstanding of the rudiments of statecraft, and unfortunately, we're paying a very heavy price for it.
Thank you.
But they're a bunch of illiterates, man.
Dókítà Ọlọ́pọlọ, do you have anything to add or ask?
Yes, I have a statement to add, and I also have a question to ask. The first statement is most modern states strive to provide a good service for their people. We need to understand that really does not happen in Nigeria. The paradigm we use in Nigeria is still based on the Fulani governing style of 1803. That's why the Almajiris that we see, like those poor young kids who were taken to court last week, you will never find a Fulani child among them. their houses and other ethnic groups. The 8, 9, 10-year-old Fulani counterpart of those children are in school, they're all in private schools, either overseas or in Nigeria, expensive schools. So that's what we need to keep in mind. It's not the job of the Nigerian government as currently constituted. Now, Tinubu may be different. I pray he's different. But definitely Buhari's style of government, Yar'Adua's style of government, and subsequent government prior to that government led by the Northerners. More often than not, they are Fulani. And their responsibility, their loyalty is a nut to the Nigerian populace. Unless we understand that simple concept, we are going to miss the whole point. Buhari will rather choose a Fulani from outside of Nigeria, from Guinea or wherever the guy was from. He will choose him over a Nigerian vying for a post. So his loyalty is to the Fulani, not to the Nigerian at all.
Yeah.
So unless we, there's a Yoruba saying, "Tomode ba shubu awuwaju, ti agba ba shubu aweyin." Unless we look back at our history and understand the MO of the Fulani rulers, they're not bad. They're doing the best for their people. Unless we look at that, we are going to miss the point. And they're not bad, as I said. They're looking out for their people. But each and every one of us thought that the people should be Nigerians. No, that's not who their people are. Their people are their own Fulani people. So we need to understand that.
Yeah, and there's a reason why, despite all of that, despite having governed for most of Nigeria's period of independence, the North is nowhere near the South, certainly the Southwest, in terms of development. Even the major cities. I was in Kano as recently as 2019. I was in Maiduguri twice in 2018. These are some of the largest cities there. There's not much going on in any of them.
There never will be much going on, Prof. There will never be much going on. Look, there are more Fulani millionaires and billionaires coming out of Nigeria.
Right.
Where do they get the money from? War development, to your country. Whereas, when people from down south steal money, one should work one shaking buy one feel hide there. But to the Fulani leaders, they are not doing anything bad if they use government money for other things other than for the people. But they will use it for the Fulanis.
Right. I think you're absolutely spot on, Dr. Oyefula. But what I'll add to that is that, well, first of all, no country can develop on the basis of clannishness in a multi-ethnic society.
Correct.
That place will not go anywhere unless you're monolithic. I'm thinking Japan, where over 95% of the people are Japanese. On the basis of your Japanese ethnicity, you organize the social. Then yes, it may work, but that's a bit of an exception. Most countries, certainly Nigeria, these are extremely multi-ethnic societies now. But I think there's a level of increasing awareness in the North. The whole Hausa Fulani rulership has in fact been Fulani hegemony, that the Hausas have been at the receiving end of these things. And you would notice when President Olusegun Obasanjo was in office and he selected his army chiefs or military chiefs in general, And then people see the whole idea of core North then came up. And they were saying, "Oh, why did you choose this folks?" And they said, "Oh, but these are Northerners." They said, "No, they are not core Northerners." A level of awakening began in that period, where folks from, say, Nasarawa, from sort of the peripheral northern states, all became aware that when the chips were down, they would not be viewed as core Northerners. So there is that. That awakening, I don't think, has translated much in terms of political mobilization. But then you look at the voting patterns, even in the most recent presidential election, then you can see alignments and so on, unlike the past where it was one voting bloc. The leaders of the North want them to go this way, and that's where everybody goes. That is changing, albeit in a very slow way. But again, the Northern leaders, I believe, more than any other group in the country, would have to help the people. In some circles, as we speak, I've been in forums where Northerners are, certainly the Northern intelligentsia, are beginning to say, look, the North has become a problem in Nigeria. And the Northern elites are at the epicenter of that problem. And they need to help their people. And that they are embarrassed by what is going on in the country. Because they know they're not oblivious of what is going on. When you say poverty, I mean, the numbers are clear. Again, before the recent devaluation, which I think has sent everybody down, basically. When you say, again, terrorism, crime, kidnapping, it's very clear where you have most of the major incidents. And in terms of frequency of occurrences as well. So when our points are not far apart in any way. It's just a question of nuance, I think. There is that, and there has always been that, because with the caliphate system, where essentially the family members of Uthman Dan Fodio, with his sons and so forth, were sent all around to head various, whether that was Ilorin or whether that was Kano and so on. And they began to govern the more numerically superior houses. But then the language prevailed, the Hausa language prevailed. But Fufude is still spoken in powerful circles. So that when the chiefs are down in the axis of power, it switches to Fula or Fufude. And folk people know that. But overall, how long that hegemony will last, we don't know. But there are things that people have to do for themselves. It cannot come from outside. The people have to be ready to do this for themselves. It took the Egyptians over 30 years or so of the rule of Hosni Mubarak to decide, okay, we have enough of you now. You need to get out. So people has to reach that threshold themselves. It can't be dictated to them.
That's true. That's very true.
Yes,
Fortunately, the awareness is growing in the north right now. The Hausas, the Zulus in the southern Sokoto, these people are becoming aware of the fact that they had been colonized for a long time by the Fulani. And there's Hausa awareness going on. And I just said that to support what you said. That's very true. My question for you is, could you please, it's not a question, it's just a request actually. Could you enlighten us about the Kanuri in the Northeast versus Fulani, the dynamics between them as it pertains to Boko Haram?
Right. Now, thank you for that. I'm treading on very slippery territory here, but as I mentioned earlier, the Boko Haram group is a Kanuri-led insurgency. It's rank and file. Certainly, its top echelon is fundamentally Kanuri. And it's viewed as a metastasis of the grievances of the Kanuri people, where in a socioeconomically deprived region, they are the poorest of the poor, essentially, and that this has played a major role in what they've become. Now, and there's a modicum of this, especially in the the actualization of that over time, certainly in the last 5-6 years, you find increasing tensions in some of the villages that have been ravaged by the so-called bandits, for example. It has pitted Kanuri communities against Fulani communities. Many of them have lived together for centuries. And so that ethnic division is becoming more palpable. It is becoming more evident. And so what is clear now is that presumed monolithic / unity that we've or at least most Southerners have often assumed, is evaporating before our eyes. People are beginning to realize that, look, this alliance has been tilted one way rather than the other. Now, but what we now see also with respect to banditry, which is dominated by the so-called Bush Fulani, is that in some instances there are collaborations amongst the top leadership of some of the groups. So, for example, bandits may kidnap X number of people and trade them or sell them at a certain rate to Boko Haram, who can then make larger and bigger demands and have capacity to hold on to those captives for weeks and months. The bandits may not have that luxury because of the need to move around and so on and so forth. So the relationship is one of a level of cooperation at a certain level, but it's also one of conflict at the communal / grassroots level. So you have conflicts that would have been unheard of 50, 60 years ago, where Kanuri villagers would go and burn the huts or homes of their Fulani neighbors. Now, keep in mind, villages have been ravaged. They're receiving letters in some cases to contribute X amounts of money to guarantee peace for a certain peace. So the push is coming to shove. This is becoming serious. Now, it was also a critical moment when then candidate Bola Ahmed Tinubu elected Kashim Shettima as his running mate. There were grumbles in some parts of the north that, he has not chosen a core northerner. He's chosen Shettima. And of course, for the Kanuris, that was a very clear message. You mean, we've been voting with you, working with you all these years, whether that was Shagari and so forth. And now one of our own cannot be VP because it's not Fulani. So I think there is that awareness. It is growing. But there's also a collective sense of identity as the North. It is becoming increasingly fragile. I think Boko Haram has increased that fragility. I think the banditry, perhaps more than Boko Haram, has increased that fragility, at least at the grassroots level. And in terms of elite level politics, the divisions are also becoming clearer. From the Obasanjo era with the selection of service chiefs to the selection of Kashim Shettima, a Kanuri man, as running mate and so forth. So I think those tensions are becoming clear. But folks who see the need for northern unity, and I'm thinking of this Northern Elders Forum. That's the name I was trying to remember. Baba Ahmed, I believe, is the most prominent spokesperson for that group. And interestingly, that spokesperson's father migrated from Morocco by his own reckoning. So he's a migrant essentially, but somehow became the spokesperson because his father became this very prominent man, had many children, sent all of them to school and all of that. But my point is, there are certain elements in the North, certain is people like Akin Baba Ahmed, that's his full name, who recognize the need for northern unity and so work hard to, make sure that happens. But there are also contours and cracks that are beginning to show at the grassroots as well as occasionally at the elite level. Again, in terms of who gets what, when, and how.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure, sir.
Olotu.
Oh, like
Okay, maybe she's
I'm
still.
sorry, I mute. I'm going to call Bashegun from London. Bashegun, sir.
Ekale, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm really not a historian, but I do read a lot of this stuff. I'm going to start by we've been talking about Northern Unity. What is sometimes forgotten is that the Kanuri used to be part of Cameroon. And there was a referendum. I can't remember whether it's 1961 or some time ago. There was a referendum in which Northern Cameroon and Southern Cameroon were asked which one wanted to be part of Nigeria, which one wanted to be part of Cameroon. The South went to Cameroon. I mean, of course, they are now fighting to leave Cameroon. And the North opted to join with Nigeria. And the people who opted to join Nigeria are the Kanuris, unless I've got the history wrong. So that it is not really surprising that that's the seed for Boko Haram. But again, as I said, I'm not a historian, but sometimes one reads this sort of stuff, so that when we are talking about the North, almost as if we say we talk mostly about Fulani and Hausa, one forgets that the Kanuris were originally not Nigerians. That's my first point. My second point is this. There is, I'm trying to find a word for it. Maybe perception might be the right word. That the Northerners the Northern elites are only now beginning to realize the folly of them leading Nigeria. I remember about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I sat at a dinner next to, I think it was Shetima Ali Mungunu, who was a minister of education in the Fulani government. We sat at the same table, and we were the two Nigerians, so we were forced to talk to each other anyway. And I remember him at that stage, long ago, complaining that the cause of the North was the fact that they had been the ones ruling Nigeria. Because they only understood power, they actually didn't know what to do with it. And I was saying to him, and I will say today, as I've been saying it for years, that the biggest problem that we have in Nigeria is that the people who hold power have contempt for the rest of us. That is a very, very big problem. That once you acquire power in the context, probably most of Africa as well, you become contemptuous of your fellow citizens. This is why a member of the House of Representatives will be beating up a Uber driver for whatever. I mean, even your servant. I mean, who do you think you are that you are, beating up? So our biggest problem, which I cannot see changing, because for me it is a Nigerian disease, is this contempt.
But it's not curable.
That's what I'm saying. This contempt that you have for people because you have power is a Nigerian disease.
Correct.
The final point that I'm going to make, I think I've already spoken about the crocodile tears that the Northerners shed. I've talked about the Kanuri not originally being Nigerians. And the final thing that I want to talk about is this. I know we were talking about, talking about the awareness that people are going to rise up and so. It will never happen. It's never going to happen in Nigeria that people are going to rise up. They are suffering at the minute, and they're not going to do anything.
Need guns.
Not only are not they going to do anything, we elites ourselves are never going to do anything. And I can say this almost with certainty, that until Nigeria breaks up, nothing good is going to come out of it. And the reason why leaders are contemptuous of us, partly is because we almost always accept fault. I don't want to deviate into other areas because I got involved in some kind of argument on a platform on Friday when we were talking about transatlantic slavery. And one of the contributors was proudly saying how the Yorubas were involved in selling slaves and so on and so forth. But he was not capable of actually listening to the questions that I was asking. That history is one of perception. As a scientist, I look at facts. It is not just simply, somebody tells me a story and I accept it. I look at facts. And the simple things that I was asking, simple things that if the Yorubas were matching all these slaves all over the damn place, where are the slave-holding pens, prison yard or whatever it is you want to call it, where they were keeping all these slaves before they sell them to the Europeans? Where are the contracts with the Europeans? What did the slave traders, all these famous Yoruba slave traders, what did they do with the money? What are they going to do with the slaves? Where are the plantations that these slaves were working at? Where are the basilicas that these slaves have built? And that is part of our problem as Black people, is that we accept fault without actually asking ourselves, is it really our fault? Are we really responsible for this? That is a very, very big problem that we have as well, but not just as Nigerians or as Europe, as Black people in general, that we accept fault. And that is why we are treated with contempt. The sort of nonsense that people agreed to, that they were selling slaves and they were telling me this big market, that big market, and so on and so forth. You will not hear a Jew saying that. You will not hear a Hindu saying that. But we proudly accept fault. I think it's part because we want to show off. I mean, somebody was talking, talking about Benin Empire, this empire, that Benin Empire. Which empire? Benin City was just a city. There was no empire. We call ourselves kingdoms and all this kind of nonsense. There were no kingdoms. There was a Yoruba kingdom, yes, but there was no Ibadan kingdom or Iwo kingdom or Benin kingdom. These were city-states. They were just cities. They were towns. They were not ruling over anybody anywhere. They were just settlements, urban settlements. And this is the problem that, as somebody, again, as I said, I'm not a historian. I'm also really not a politician. Although I founded the Yoruba Party in the UK in February. That's my first foray into politics. But it opens your eyes to the kind of people that we are, which makes it very difficult when you are talking about grassroots motivation, whatever it is you want to call it, awareness, which makes it difficult. And which now brings me to my final point.
Oh, I have to ask you to be brief, sir. We are running out of time.
Okay. I'll leave it. I'll leave it there.
No, if you want to make it very quick, we can take it.
Well, I was just going to talk about leadership. That really what we require. I mean, for me, I want Yoruba nation. So don't let's mince words. That's just me.
All right.
All right. I have no truck with Nigeria whatsoever. I couldn't care less.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, thank you.
But for me, our biggest problem is leadership. You know,
leadership in Nigeria or leadership among the Yoruba people?
Same. It's the same. We don't. You see, when you talk about leader, I mean, you know, we are talking about leadership, and you know, there was an argument. Somebody was saying, "Oh, it's a question of vision." So I was saying, the people who rule us now, they go to Europe. They see what Paris is like. They see what London is like. What other vision do you need?
Exactly.
That you can't simply say, I want my country to be like France, to be like USA, and then you walk towards it. So the idea that you need some kind of vision is poppycock. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention.
Nice.
That is extremely loaded. And although too, I'm almost late for my next commitment, but I will respond
yes, we are done actually.
Yeah, I'll
we are
respond
going to let you go.
All right.
So thank you so much. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to just say to the chair of the Yoruba Party in the UK, thank you for your contributions. Yes, part of what you spoke to is about the superficiality of colonial borders. And so people who could just cross a stream or river and visiting their cousins and so on, suddenly they're now from different countries. It shows the idiocy of that arrangement and the failure of modern African states, post-independent African states, to address those issues. We ought to be by now close to what you now have in the EU, where it's borderless. You just go through. You don't have to see any immigration person, and you know your passport or your ID card is automatically scanned, and you move on. Again, you spoke to leaders and a contempt for the people. There's some scholarship on that, certainly in political science and history and the field of sociology, so-called African big manism. And I think there's a socio-psychological dimension to that. And I think part of that comes from being surrounded by large numbers of impoverished people. I think there's that very egocentric dimension to power holding in that part of the world, and where unfortunately the people have come to expect that, and they've learned to live with that, and they've come to deify and worship that. I will leave it at that, and then back to you, Madam Olotu.
Thank you so much. It's been very, very. I'm trying to look for one not too big Oyinbo to use. I'm very grateful. I have learned. It's been a very great learning experience. There are things that I never had before, and yet I always want to learn about Boko Haram. I learned it today, and I will forever be grateful. So on behalf of our wise men, the three Amoyes, and on behalf of all lovers of Yoruba, the wide world, this is not the amount that we usually the fact that we were late, there were many people that still join us on our radio, Philadelphia, and also with YouTube. So on behalf of all of them, I'm saying a big thank you to you. Baba Deboye. Baba Deboye.
Mowambi.
Okay, you want to say something? Because we are ready to close.
Given that we've run out of time, the only thing that I would like to say is hope that our guests will return before long, because the questions that I have
Like before the end of the year, right?
Well, whenever is able to do it. First of all, before I must say thank you. Before I say anything else, thank you very, very much. However,
please come
back.
An
Opportunity for us to learn and learn broadly is driven by the pain that we have been feeling for 1,000 years. That pain is very difficult to summarize in Boko Haram or this or that by itself in isolation of a whole complexity. I thank you also for, whoever brought up the issue of Islam being a source of a problem all by itself. Scholarship has been in the Islamic world for ages. I'm holding a book here that says God's Crucible, Islam and the Making of Europe, 570 AD to 1215, written by one David Lebrin Lewis. It contains a lot that says Islam has been part and parcel of knowledge building way before Europe even became significant.
Yes.
However, that cannot be looked at in isolation because culture is an aspect, education is only an aspect of culture. Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the culture that bred them had been male-centric, too male-centric, so that women were relegated into the background most of that culture, of the cultural life before modernization among them improved a lot of women. And that is the source of poverty. It is poverty, not Islam. It is the poverty bred by Abrahamic cultures that created the problem that we have in Africa, where religion is now confused with poverty and abuse and what have you. And then we have challenges. If you want a counter, go to the Yoruba. The Yoruba, for reasons best known to them, did not abuse women the way other cultures have. That's why we not only have Oba, we didn't put them all the way to the top either, but we have them in key positions. Your Iyalode, Iyanifa, Iyani this, and so on and so forth. So we did have a methodology for handling the growth of children, not just physically, but psychologically as well, for making women participate as fully as possible. And that's the difference that you are seeing between Yoruba civilization and civilization in the rest of Africa. So all of these things to me say that we must wonder of what benefit is Nigeria, where a people who have evolved a culture over millennia that you can see even in their mutual tolerance of imported religions, that those people must live and suffer with people who have only inherited a male chauvinist religion, a male chauvinist culture, and use it to pollute a religion and hand it to us in the South as if Islam is always backward. My mother sent many children to school and supported them, and they were all Muslims. My mother was cooking for Muslim children living in my house with her, cooking for them at night so they could carry on the fasting the next day. Yoruba didn't have a problem with tolerating differences. And they didn't brand a person inferior just because he was different in faith or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, we need to come back to some of that. There is no need for, there is no real use for an overly diversified society. I don't quarrel with diversity, but there's what I call unmanageable diversity, where in order for the diversity to even be recognized, you have to depress civilization for decades, if not centuries, in order to say you are making room for diversity. We don't want that. We don't need that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I should go. Yeah.
So, thank you so much. Baba said you are coming back. Is that a yes?
Baba is begging.
Oh, okay. Baba Mbebe.
By the way, I'm a product of the African Church.
Oh, fantastic.
And so you must know private Lakeru, private Oludode, Aboyade Kogol. All of those people are for very good stock.
Well, school animal law, and not the church, but the school, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, but we would have learned about them.
I see.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody that made it today.
Well, look, Mama mi, Molila bi ara bara, ara kagun. Let's go. Molila fed
Yeah.
Afro-grams.
Adupe. Please, let's meet here by the grace of God next week on Yoruba Gbode. Next week, we want to compare education. We want to look at education in Nigeria. Education in Nigeria, is it quantity, quality, and is there hope for better future? Let's meet. Thank you so much. On behalf of everybody, mo dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ yín. Ẹni tó fúnni lówó kò fẹ́ kébi ó pa ni, ẹni tó fúnni nímọ̀ kò fẹ́ kárìn lókun àìnímọ̀, ẹni tó fúnni lọ́mọ kò fẹ́ ká jàjẹrun bí iṣu. Mo dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ yèyé mi o, Egbinọlá Adékúnbí, àtúnwá ẹ̀dùn tó kọ́ mi láṣà mo jèrè àṣà. Ire ní mògùn ará àlágbẹ̀dẹ ibi tó bá wà.
Ilẹ̀ rẹ ni o.
Ẹ ṣeun.
Ẹ pè mí o. Ẹ pè mí o, mo náwó sókè látẹ̀kọ́ o.
Ta ni?
Èmi ni Adétúnjì ọmọ àtọwọ́lọ́kọ máa jáde bò kí lẹ́jọ́.
Ọ̀dà àmọ̀ ṣe àlejò ti lọ, nígbà tẹ wọlé náà ni àlejò pàtàkì lọ. Ẹ̀yin lẹ mọ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ ti ṣe o. Ire o.
Tí mo ti náwó látẹ̀kan.
Èmi ò rọ́wọ́ yín o. Mi ò rọ́wọ́ yín o.
Bọ̀ rọ́wọ́ mi, dẹ́mọ̀ mo wà.
Láàrin yín nílùú ìlú òkun, kò ní rẹ̀yìn láṣẹ Ọlọ́run. Ó dàrẹ́ à ń retí donation gbogbo èèyàn.
Èkìtì ò ṣe dẹmọ rí o.
Ìjẹ̀bú ni mí o.
Ìjẹ̀bú ò ṣe dẹmọ rí.
Ẹ má gbàgbé o. Ẹ má gbàgbé Minister of Education Ọ̀nàbámiró.
Àfihàn
nìkan.
Mo fẹ́ lọ sínú gbogbo ṣọ̀ṣọ́ gbogbo ṣọ̀ṣọ́ ni mo wá.
SD Ọ̀nàbámiró.